Hey everybody, welcome to the 5th episode of the Network Automation series, and today is going to be a continuation of our last episode, where we started doing some interface configurations on the Catalyst and Nexus devices, and we got layer 3 configured. We enabled DHCP on this port, we configured IP addressing on this interface of the Catalyst and this interface of the Nexus, but we didn't get around to configuring the Nexus interfaces for layer 2. We actually assigned this to the interface config, but we didn't get VLANs assigned to it. We didn't set it up as an access port or anything. So we can see in the screen that we've added 2 hosts. We have host 1, which we're going to assign to VLAN 20, and we have host 2 that we're going to assign to VLAN 30. We're going to use these 2 hosts to get basically VLAN configuration done, get an SVI set up, VLAN interface for each of these hosts to have a default gateway, and we're going to get the VLANs configured and managed on the device. So all of our configuration day is going to be focused on the Nexus. But what we are going to do is we're going to look at doing some better organization of the tasks that we previously created, and we're going to look at how we go about setting up the Nexus to manage all of these different things with its host variable file. So with the Alpine host that we have here, I just want to show you, we have them set up with a host name. We have an IP address set up. So we've got 10.1.2100 here with the default gateway of 10.1.2254. And then if we look at the other host, we have 10.1.3100 and a default route of 10.1.3254. And I like these Alpine hosts because they're super lightweight. They don't take up a lot of resources. So if you want to have some systems where you can test network connectivity or some other features, you can come over here and you can do a little research on the Alpine host. This is the CML Cisco documentation. And we've got some iPerf capability. You can do some OSPF BGP control traffic generation, packet capture, traceroute. So there's a lot of functionality in this very small, very minimal resource consuming system. The important part here is that this will show you how to get the system configured. Now, by default, the system uses Ethernet 0 as its first interface, so that's something to be aware of when you go to pull this networking configuration. Make sure if you're using ETH0 that you update this to be ETH0. We're not doing any internal networking here, so you wouldn't need this. We would just need our default gateway setup, which is what this line does. So we're going to set an IP, we're going to turn the link up, and then we're going to set our default route, which if we go back and look at the configuration, you can see we've done that, set an IP address, set the link to be up, and then set a default route. So again, today the focus is on getting this Nexus switch set up. We'll go back and we'll tweak the task configuration to make it a little more organized, and we'll talk about why when we hop over to Visual Studio Code. So let's go ahead and take a second and we'll jump over there and start working on our code today. Over in Visual Studio Code now, we have our automation jump host up. The interface config directory where we were working with our playbook and our tasks and our host variables is open. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at our tasks. Now in the last episode, or I should say a lot of my episodes, I've mentioned like making sure your tasks are very organized, very easy to work with, and not having a whole lot going on with them. And if we take a look at this file, we can see that we enabled interfaces, we did layer 3, we set DHCP, then we did it on the Nexus, and then we set Nexus layer 3. We could very easily add the layer 2 configurations to this file and start managing, that configuration as part of this task. But what I want to do today is clean this up because we're going to add a couple more lines of things. We're going to start managing additional aspects of the Nexus device. So what I want to do is I want to click on this interface configs, and on Windows, the hotkey to rename is F2, and we're going to call this Enable Interfaces. And then I want to create a new file here called configure L2 or L3 ins.yaml. But then I'm also going to create an additional file, and I'm going to call it configure_L2_ins.yaml. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to grab this layer 3 portion here, and I'm going to cut it, and I'm going to paste it in this new configure L3 ins. And then I'm going to come back I'm going to remove the DHCP and layer 3 portions of iOS out. And I'm going to paste them at the top. So now, if we take a look at this, I have a very clean enable interfaces task. All this task does is enable my interface, set a description, and do it for either Nexus or iOS. For the NXOS device, we also make sure we configure the modes, so managing the layer 2 or layer 3 state of the interface. For the actual IP addressing portion, I've now moved that into configure L3 ints. And now this task is only focused on configuring layer 3 interfaces. So now I have a super clean task where I know that all this task does is configure L3 portions of the network devices. So any other L3 interface type things I'd want to do would happen here. Now today, when we actually start doing our L2 configurations, we'll put the interface configurations here. If we decide to do some VLAN management, we could add another task for VLAN configurations. But basically what I wanted to show you is that this helps us keep our tasks organized and just create more effective, more easy to work with automation. And now we can come back to this configure interfaces playbook, and actually what I can do here is just now copy this line. We'll do 2 quick pastes, and then we'll do the enable underscore interfaces, and then we'll do configure underscore L3 ints. And I'm just going to copy that, and I'm going to paste this, and I'm going to call it L2 ints. And we're going to do this as enable ints, and this will be configure L3, and this will be configure L2. And we'll save it. So again, from a playbook management standpoint, this is our playbook. I just very quickly added 2 additional tasks to call, plus their tags, to point to the tasks directory we created, where we added a new L3 and L2 ints file, and then renamed this enable interfaces file. So all of this has been updated. We can start looking at doing our L2 configurations. Now, we know that we're going to add 2 VLANs. We're going to do VLAN 20 and VLAN 30. We know that we're going to update the interfaces for ETH1.2 and 1.3. And we need to set them up as access ports. So let's go over to the Nexus 9KV switch 1 configuration. We can see that previously we had set up ETH1.2. We did not set an IP or a VLAN. I'm going to copy this, paste it, and we're going to just add 1.3. Again, it won't have an IP. It is going to be layer 2. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add another variable, and I'm going to set this to VLAN 30. I'm going to come up to ETH1.2, and I'm going to add another variable called VLAN 20. And then like we did with the IP addressing and DHCP options, we're going to just set another VLAN tag for ETH1.1, but even though it's not going to use it, we're going to set it to none. And so this gives us a variable to say, hey, when you loop through the interfaces, if you don't find this variable here, just go ahead and skip it because it's none. At least we've defined it. If you don't define it and it looks for it, then it's going to go, well, there's no variable called VLAN in the item that it's taking a look at. So now we've got our interfaces set up. We have VLAN set up. What we're going to do next is do another interface, and we're going to do name VLAN 20. And we're going to do another interface of a name VLAN 30. Now, very similar to what we did with our ETH1.1 interface, we're going to grab all these details here. Because we need to get the layer 3 configuration done. These are going to be our SVIs. So interface VLAN 20, interface VLAN 30. We're going to do gateway for VLAN 20 as a description. And then we'll set an IP address up of 10.1.20.254. And then for this one, we're going to do 10.1.30.254. I'm just going to copy this gateway command or description, set this here, and call it gateway for VLAN 30. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 interfaces on our device. We're managing the VLANs inside this interfaces for the interfaces, and managing the IP addressing as well for our SVIs and our ETH11 interface. So I'm going to save that. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to take a look at our module that we're going to use today to actually configure the layer 2 ports. So let's move over to Ansible-docs and take a look at that. In the terminal, we want to do Ansible-doc cisco.nxos.nxos_L2_interfaces. And in here, we can see that when we call the NXOS L2 interfaces module, we're going to create a dictionary of layer 2 interface options using config, and then we can set our attributes. So we can set access, and underneath of it, we can do a VLAN. We can set the mode of the interface. We'll call our name, and then if we want to set a trunk, we could do that. Now, the interesting thing is I've never used the mode command as part of my configurations because setting trunk or setting access indicates to Ansible when it's doing its configuration to use mode access mode trunk. But if you wanted to set the mode before you actually run this portion, you could use the mode command and then use .WinQ tunnel, access trunk, vex fabric, fabric path. So again, for things like vex fabric or .WinQ tunnel, fabric path, you may want to set the mode. For access and trunk, because these values are setting those specific attributes, you won't have to. For trunk, we can do allowed VLANs or native VLAN. And then if we come down and just take a look at a quick sample, we can see Cisco NXOS L2 interfaces, config, the name of the interface we're going to configure, and then they've done a trunk with a native VLAN here and some allowed VLANs. And then they've done another interface that's an access port in VLAN 30. So we're going to grab this configuration, and we're going to come to configure L2 ints, and we're going to paste it. And then we're going to say configure layer 2 interfaces on Nexus. We're going to delete this portion, and then we're going to leave this. So what we're going to do is we're going to set for name, double quotes, item.name, and then we're going to do double quotes, double bracket, item.vlan, and then we're going to say when Ansible_network, if I can type, OS equals NXOS, and VLAN or item.vlan does not equal none. So what we're saying here is, much like we've done with some of the other interfaces, when you're looping through the variables in interfaces, if you see VLAN none, just skip it. We're not going to configure VLAN. So if it's not none, like this, VLAN 20, go ahead and run this module. Same with ETH13, but for these other interfaces, VLAN 20, VLAN 30, we're not going to do any configuration there. But it will run the configuration for the layer 3 interfaces so that we can get them set up and configured. So save that. But there's one very important thing that I didn't mention that we need to address for configuring SVIs on the Nexus. And we don't have it set up. We have L2, we have L3, we have enabled interfaces. What could we be missing to actually set up an SVI on a Nexus switch? Well, with Nexus, by default, SVIs are not enabled. The interface-vlan feature needs to be turned on. So what we can do is we can come here, do an Ansible-doc, and we'll just do a -L. And there's a module to enable features on Cisco NXOS devices. And we're going to do a / cisco.nxos. And we'll come down and we'll look and we see there's cisco.nxos_feature. So we'll copy that and we'll do an Ansible-doc cisco.nxos feature. And so basically you're just going to say, call the module, identify the feature, and what's the state of it. So we need to turn on interface-vlan. That is the actual configuration we want to turn on. So we would just do a name to define it. We're going to enable SVIs or interface-vlan, call the module, call the feature, get the state. So what we'll do is we will create another task called enable features.yaml. And then we're going to do name enable VLAN interfaces SVIs on Nexus switches. We'll call our module. We'll say feature. Need some spaces there. Feature interface-vlan state enabled. So this is a very important thing to remember about understanding your devices and understanding the configurations required to get the interfaces set up. If I had not set this feature up, it would have gone to go configure the layer 3 SVIs and said, hey, I can't do this because interface VLAN 20 is not an option. It would just set invalid config. By enabling this, we are going to make sure that the option to configure VLAN interfaces is available, and it'll go through the process and configure it. So this is getting into more of an order of operations thing. If we save this and we go to configure interfaces, we'd want to make sure that the feature is enabled before we go to configure interfaces. Now we're doing it here. We're going to configure this feature as part of this task, but more than likely you would want to put this in another set of playbooks where you're kind of configuring like your system. Like if you know your system's going to use interface VLANs, if you want other features turned on, again, like VXLAN, I would encourage you to have it like under this basic system config would more have been the ideal place to start turning on features. But since we're kind of building on all of this configuration through these different episodes, this is an absolutely fine place to do it as we talk about the different modules and capabilities that you get with Ansible and managing your network devices. So we'll do an import tasks. We'll do enable or /tasks /enable _features.yaml. And then we'll do tags, enable features. And so we've got our features enabled. We're going to turn up all of our interfaces. We've got L3 set up to be configured. And we've got our layer 2 interface configurations. Oh, and one more thing we want to do. Loop interfaces. So this will loop through the interfaces, define our layer 2 interfaces. And then I need to make sure features only runs when we have NXOS. All right, so that should do it. So you should be able to come down here now and run our playbook. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll do Ansible-playbook, configure interfaces.yaml, set our username, set -k. And so it's going to start running through the playbook. So it's going to go to the Nexus device first and do the enable features. So we'll see that do it now. It enabled VLAN interfaces on Nexus switches. And I probably should say enable VLAN interface feature on Nexus switches. It's configuring our Catalyst devices. Now, these are already done. We don't need to worry about it. But you can see that Ansible's just giving you a state check to let you know that nothing's changed. I haven't made any updates. It has changed ETH13 to update it to have an access port config, but it failed now on VLAN 20 and VLAN 30 because we haven't set those interfaces up. So let's take a look at this. So it's trying to apply the no switch port command. Well, that's not an option on our interfaces. So let's go take a look at our variable file. And so we can see that VLAN 20 has this mode of layer 3. And it's already a layer 3 interfaces. So it's trying to set no switch port in that configuration, and it's not an option. So we need to think about how we're going to work around that. I'm going to try doing none. And we'll look at the layer 3 interfaces. So actually it's enable interfaces. All right. So what we might want to do here is treat an SVI as a unique type of configuration. We'll delete mode from here. We'll leave this all here. And we'll do and mode. Let's do item.mode does not equal none. Double quote that. And then we'll say when it does equal none, we'll configure our interface. So now we're going to call this Cisco NXOS SVI interfaces. Save it, and we'll rerun it. What this should do is look at those configurations. It should go, okay, well, if it's not set to none, we're going to manage our layer 2, layer 3 state of the switch port. But for an SVI, because there is no mode, we will configure the name description and turn the interface up, but we will not try to enable a mode like do no switch port because it's just not a valid option. So we're back at the point where it failed, and we can see that it skipped the SVIs. It is now configured VLAN 20 with an IP address. It is configured VLAN 30 with an IP address. It went back and did the layer 3 on the iOS. It's done DHCP. Again, these are all done, so these things have all checked out. But you see, this is one of the things with Ansible. We failed at this point, but this data applied, and you can see where you could get yourself in trouble where some stuff is configured, some things didn't. Again, we failed again. This is having an issue with the conditional check of NXOS and item failed. So let's take a look at, this is L2ins. And it probably doesn't like that I didn't put that in quotes. We'll look at so it probably didn't like that. But we know it failed towards the end here, so what we'll do is do a -- tags. And it's going to be config L2ins. So now we're only going to run that portion of the playbook. And it failed again. No. All right, so let's take a look at this. So we did config access VLAN. It says the conditional check Ansible Network OS equals NXOS and item VLAN does not equal none, failed. I tried to do it on a cat AKV for some reason, so did I? No, I did. Should be equals NXOS. Let's try that one more time. So very important to make sure you get your conditionals right. So this should be 2 equal signs, not a single equals, as we can see there. All right, so one more time. This should be the magic to make it work. And there we go. So now it's configuring our access ports. We set an IP address, or we didn't set it. We set an access port with VLAN 20 and VLAN 30. And now we should be able to go over to CML and take a look at those interfaces. Let's jump over there. So we've got the Nexus. We can pull up our console. We'll log in as netadmin with our password. And I mistyped it, so let's try that again. Netadmin. All right. So we didn't do anything with VLANs. We didn't actually run an interface mod or a VLAN module to configure VLANs. But if we do show VLAN, we've got 1, but we don't have 20 or 30 in here. So let's take a look at our show run. We'll look at eth1/2. So it did access VLAN 20. But it didn't actually assign the VLAN to the configuration. We should be able to do show run in VLAN 20. And we configured a VLAN 20 interface. We do show run. We still only see VLAN 1. So normally when you type switchport access VLAN 20, it would say, hey, it's not here. Go ahead and add it, but in this case it did not. So let's go back and we'll take a look at a new file called configure VLANs.yaml. And we'll look at the Ansible doc. Do a search for Cisco to NXOS, and there should be VLANs. Get rid of the -L, take a look at that module. And so we'll set the module, configure a dictionary of VLAN options. It's going to be name, whether it's active or suspended. But for our purposes, it should be pretty simple. We're going to grab this block, set a name and an ID. Try that again. All right. Configure NXOS VLANs. And we'll do item.vlan. And then we'll call it see what we got here. We use the description that's already assigned. So we use the item.description in addition to the VLAN. Actually, we can't do that because it's a description and the name has to be like underscores. So we're not going to give it a name. Let's do hosts underscore, and we'll use the item, we'll do host in underscore. So what this should do is it'll loop through our interfaces when I set the loop. And then it's going to set a name of hosts in, and actually I'm going to do VLAN. So just call it hosts in VLAN 20, hosts in VLAN 30. It will use this value here to assign the rest of the name, or at least it should if I did it right. We'll come back to this real quick and just grab these two details. So when Ansible Network OS is NXOS and item.vlan does not equal none, loop through interfaces. We will go back to our playbook. We will copy the enable features, and we're going to do enable, actually configure VLANs. Config VLANs. Configure VLANs. All right, so now we're going to run our playbook again, and we're going to only run the config VLANs section because we don't need to run the whole playbook again. And you can see where the value of having the tags is. We've built this playbook out. We've got all these tasks, but we can focus on the ones that didn't get applied. And hopefully this works. Hopefully I configured things right, and it looks like it is running it. We should be able to go back and look at the switch in a second and see that it applied the names. We didn't do anything with cat AKV internet. And if we do show VLAN 20, it did double quotes for this VLAN 20. Let's take a look at that. I wouldn't have expected it to do that. Where is my configure VLANs? I mean, I wouldn't have expected to do that because this double quotes to indicate it's a variable. I wonder if I do that. So we're just going to change the name. And we'll come back and look at the switch and see. So it did update it, but it left the quotes there. And it could be something to do with the fact that the value is set and it's just putting it in quotes. I'd have to look into why that's doing that because I don't know offhand. But we can see it did apply it. It did set the name the way we wanted it to. And just to clean up this naming, I'm just going to do, I'll leave it alone. We'll look into making this better. The easy option would be to come back and do another interface section, another value. But you can see where now we're starting to build out the scale of the specific interfaces key, or yeah, I should say variable that we're working with. And we're managing a lot of different things underneath the interfaces. Again, there are other ways to do this. For the purposes of just having something simple to work with for right now, I thought this was a good way to do it. But we can see now where maybe this is starting to get a little unwieldy. We're managing VLANs, or managing layer 3 state, layer 2 state. There's probably other ways that we could do it. In fact, there are other ways to do it. We could take the VLANs out of here and just get this to a point where, the interfaces are really just turning them up. We could do a layer 3 interfaces where we define what our specific layer 3 values are, because we really need to focus on this value and maybe this value for certain devices. And then for our layer, our SVIs, same thing. Like we would just need to know the name and IP. We don't need this mode option. So there's things we could do with our host variable file that would make this more efficient. Again, for the purposes of this video, just working through what we're doing here, I wanted to show you how to work with, situations where you do need to do things like this, where you might have an interface that doesn't need something called out, like this VLAN or this IP address, and how you manage that with conditionals in our layer 3 interfaces or our layer 2 interfaces, or even with our VLANs. So we've got a pretty extensive configuration now. Let's see if we can actually ping our devices. We'll go back And then we'll do a ping of 10.1.20.100. And so we've got access to the 20 host, and we've got access to the 30 host. We'll come over for sanity check, just check the other directions. We'll do the VLAN 30 host first. We'll do ping 10.130.254. It is alive. And we're able to ping that. We can also ping the 254 address. And we can ping the 100 address because the switch here knows about those routes. So if I do show IP route, we can see that they're locally connected, so it knows where 10.130/24 is. We know where 10.120/54 is. So even though we're not trying to get out, it can reach the other host across the network. So we didn't have to do anything with routing. But if I try to do ping 8.8.8, for instance, it's going to try to go out through the 9kV to the internet, which it can't because we don't have a default gateway set up. So that's where we're going to leave this episode. We've got our host set up now. We've got VLANs set up on here, so we've done layer 2 connectivity. The next thing to do would be to manage routing, set up NAT, so that these two hosts could reach all the way out to the internet. And if we wanted to update files or applications on these hosts, there's a update tool. I think it's APK on the Alpine host that you can run to do file installs or software updates. But basically what we want to do is set up a static route here to get over to the Cat8kV internet, and then set up this interface as a NAT inside and this interface as a NAT outside. Identify the two networks that we want to have access to the internet, and then set up ACLs on the Cat8kV internet. And that would wrap up this first stage of network automation with these devices. The whole point of these episodes were to build out a very simple configuration to manage this router, this switch, some hosts, and then get full network connectivity from here all the way to the network or internet and back without touching the CLI. And we've demonstrated that it's possible. So again, our next episode will cover that. I think in between these episodes, I'm going to look at how do we do a couple other things. One thing we haven't talked about is whenever you shut these devices down, the configuration gets wiped out. And I'm going to show you that real quick. I'm going to stop both these devices. I didn't save anything. We'll leave those two switches up. I'm going to bring this back up. We'll talk about how we start saving the configurations. Now we've got this awesome playbook set up. I can easily just reconfigure these devices really quickly. We're going to boot this Nexus switch up. I didn't set the boot variable for it, so it doesn't know to start up with that. But essentially, when this system starts back up, it's not going to have anything more than whatever the default was when I first set it up day one. And every time that I bring this lab up, I actually run through all of the playbooks and things that we've created in the past to get us stood back up to where we are for the episode that we're about to record. And so now I've got a very extensive playbook. I can get this fully configured back up to, I can start looking at the show commands of the device, which don't really need to do, but for basic system config, I can set up banner, hostname, NTP, SNMP again. I can now run interface config, and where in the last episode we only turned L3 ints up, I'm going to turn the features back on for the Nexus. I'm going to configure VLANs on the Nexus. We're going to enable our interfaces. We're going to configure the L3 interfaces, and we're going to configure the L2 interfaces. And these devices will be right back up and running where I left them. Now, another thing I want to talk about, and we'll do in another video, is I've got all this config on this automation jump host. It's it's only there until I stop it and I wipe the device. What I want to do at this point is look at how we use Git, how we could use something like GitHub, GitLab to actually back up our repositories and have data saved somewhere where we can, pull it back down to a new device to start doing new automation things. So there'll be a video covering that. We're going to take all this system config. I'm going to make it available to everybody, and we're going to store it in GitHub. We'll show you how to push data up to Git. We'll show you how to clone the data back down. We're going to wipe this Ubuntu host and then pull everything back in like, nothing ever changed. And then, okay, well, this is up. And then we'll work through, how to manage files with Git and the value of having it. Because, we've built this really awesome configuration here. We've got a lot of good things to work with, if we wanted to build some additional network automation. So I'll show you how to back all that up. And just to prove to you that the Nexus is really wiped, Gig 1, which automatically does DHCP. I think I might have set that by default, but Gig 2 isn't set up. We've got our management interface set up, but I don't have any banner. I don't have SNMP. Nothing else is running on here. See if the Nexus switch is back up. It's not quite up yet, but the Nexus switch is going to be in the same place. So now I can run this. I can get it all back up to where I want it to be. And, in a matter of, couple minutes, which I could shorten by doing some Ansible configurations to speed it up, but in a couple minutes I will have my environment right back up to where I left it. So even though I lost configurations, and I knew I was going to lose it, even though I've lost those configurations, I'm able to rebuild this environment back up the way I want it and manage it because I already have this Ansible configuration configured to manage the network. So I hope this is valuable. I hope you can kind of see, some of the direction we're going to go in. Let me know what you think about, where we are today, what we've done, what you'd like to see differently. Is there something else you want to know about? We're going to work on adjusting some of these variables. I'm going to look at some ways that we could possibly modify this to make it a little more efficient. But for a first crack at just building some network automation, like this is a good way to, start looking at things and start managing it. And then as you start getting more experience with it, you can go, well, I want to try to do some things differently. I mean, maybe I want to move my VLANs somewhere else. So we'll address that in another video. I'll show you how we can get all this data out, get these interfaces cleaned up and make the variable a little more efficient than it is right now. And yeah, I'll cover the other things. We'll start looking at GitHub. We'll start looking at some more Linux commands and how to operate the different Linux hosts on here. And then we'll also work on getting some IP routing set up so that we have full network connectivity from our hosts here all the way out to the WAN internet. And since we're back up real quick, just to show you, do a show VLAN. That's the quick. It's not. And it's not fully up yet, but you can see no interface config, no VLANs, no banner, nothing. Like the box is back day one. And all I got to do is kick off all of these different Ansible playbooks and I'll be back up and running. So I'm going to do that in a separate video. It's going to be a little 5-minute video just to show you, hey, look, we're back to zero. This is how quickly Ansible can get your lab spun up once you've got, a working automation environment. So again, thanks for watching the video, and any feedback you have, let me know, and I'd be glad to do some videos around your questions and how I can help you do more automation. Again, thanks for watching.